All right. Hello, everyone. I appreciate you joining today's partner webinar. My name is Sam Krebs. I'm the channel sales manager at PreVeil. So if you ever have questions about your partner agreement, need sales and marketing materials, or anything else partner related, you can reach out to me directly. If you have any questions or interest in joining the partner program, you can reach out to partnercompliance@prevail.com. And today I am joined by a group of people. But first, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jamie Leupold, our Director of Channel Sales and Alliances, who will be leading today's webinar. So with that being said, Jamie, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today on our bi-monthly partner webinar. Looking forward to presenting some important information this month. We've got a quick update on CMMC. We've got some product updates, and then I think the core focus, and I'll get into the introduction here in just a second, but is really on helping you, our partners in our partner ecosystem, understand your obligations and responsibilities as it pertains to CMMC, helping your customers get assessed. And the reason for that conversation, and I think we brought on somebody that's an expert in this field, in Tim Schilbach. Tim is with Penacity. Tim, just a quick introduction. We've got a slide on Penacity, but great for you to just share a little bit more about your background.
Absolutely. So thank you for having me here today. And it's been a pleasure to be an interactive portion of the PreVeil ecosystem for a while now. I'm Dr. Timothy Schilbach. I'm actually 30 years U.S. military. Came out of the National Security Agency in Cybercom as a technical director in global offensive operations. So I have a very deep background in cybersecurity, threat actors, and whatnot. I'm also very intimately familiar with securing systems, as I've done assessments interior to the DoD for almost a 30-year period as well, as a military officer. So hopefully I can bring a wealth of experience here today and answer everyone's questions, as we've been integrated into the CMMC ecosystem from the very beginning, as well as serving on the panels and boards of the Cyber AB to help generate the documentation and some of the regulatory elements and feedbacks that are necessary in order to be able to make this regulation move forward. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Tim. And also, we brought you on because you elevated the dress code quite a bit. And I would have masked you, but being up here, Boston area, it is freezing. So unfortunately, I had to choose. I could either feel my fingers and wear this, or dress up in a suit and not be able to type. So had to go with function over formality. The agenda: a quick update on CMMC. I'm sure most of you know it is now officially live. We also have our VP of Product, Greg, who's going to do a quick product demo, an exciting new feature that we've rolled out. And then we'll get into the bulk of the presentation, just helping you guys understand, what your obligations are under CMMC to ensure that your clients have a successful outcome, and touch a little bit more upon how you can leverage the partner ecosystem within PreVeil to fill in any gaps you may potentially have. And then we've got some questions that were submitted in advance that we'll get to. So, CMMC timeline, CMMC is here. Assessments have started. We're working with a number of customers that are going through the assessment process right now. The assessments did start in January as CFR 32 was fully enacted. What you won't necessarily see right now is CMMC appearing in contracts. So everything right now is of pre-CMMC being a requirement in contracts. That was going to coincide with the CFR 48 rule. That's still expected to be released sometime, either this quarter, maybe it gets pushed out just a little bit due to the administration changes, and we see it coming a little bit in May or later in the summer. But the counterpoint to that is, a lot of folks think, well, CMMC might be going away. I don't know if any of you saw the news, but the DoD has hired a new CISO, and it's actually a very familiar face in Katie Arrington. For those of you that haven't been following CMMC from the beginning, Katie Arrington actually introduced CMMC 1.0. So we think that this is a pretty solid indication from this new administration that CMMC is here to stay, and Katie, will be a driving force to see it move forward. So with that, I'm now to turn it over to Greg for a quick product update and demo.
All right, great. Thanks, Jamie. I'm going to walk you through a new feature that's in the latest version of the desktop client application, the version that is available on the download site right now. If you go to prevail.com/download, and it is the 5.7.0 release. So we're going to take a look at that. And if you ever don't know which release of PreVeil you're on, you can always check by hovering up in the corner and rolling to the bottom, it'll tell you which version you're on, just in case you don't know. And okay, so I'm on 5.7.0. This is the new feature. So we call it folder watching and notifications, right? So a lot of times when you're collaborating with a shared folder with a bunch of folks, people make changes because you're collaborating on a shared project, let's say, and then you'd have to communicate out of band currently. So all the people that are sharing the folder would be aware someone has made a change on, let's say, on a team. So what we've done is introduce a feature to help with that a lot. There's a new piece of navigation here called Watched. And these are folders that, you as a user, you can select any folders you like if they're shared, basically. So the ones with little peoples. And if you want to watch them for changes, you select them and then hit the eyeball here, and that will add them into your watched items list. Now, if anyone else makes a change or you make a change to those folders now, anyone that is watching that folder will get notified that a change has been made. And there's also a new UI where you can look at and track the folders that you are watching. And you can also see the recent changes to the folders you are watching. So that's, there's a lot of new UI here that I'll take a minute to go through, but it's really intuitive. If I go to the watched user interface, it'll start out with the recent changes tab, and it's just going to summarize in reverse chronological what changes have happened to folders I'm watching. And I can go in and get details on any of this, and I can see like which folder, and I can see more about the change itself if I need more detail, or I could just click on it and it'll take me straight to that item, and I can look in there and see what's new based on the watched item notification that I got. So then the other thing I can see here is I can manage my watched items. So right now we just added a couple just now live. I also had a couple others I was watching already. And so these are the items I'm watching. From here, I can decide how often I want to be notified when changes happen to these folders. So I can get it set to immediate right now. So if anyone makes a change, then anyone that's watching this folder will get notified of that change. And I'll show you that in a second. But you can turn that off if you don't want those emails and just use this UI to track changes periodically. Do whatever you like. It's very flexible. And then from here, you can also unwatch thing. If you select something, you can see this little unwatch the item. I can stop watching it if the project has ended or I no longer have interest in following along with that. Yeah, so there's an example. So let's pick a folder. Let's look at Project Z. And we'll see there's some other subfolders in here, but let's just go into Drive and add a file to Project Z. So here are the folders we're just looking at. I'll upload something. Yeah, so here's a CUI training aid document, and we just added that in here. That's now been added to the folder. And so there are other users watching the Project Z folder. So I'm going to switch to be one of those other users for a second. Just so you can see what another user that is watching this folder's experiences. So basically, I'll go to this user. This user has Project Z in their watched items list, in their actual PreVeil access, and in their watched items list. So I can see that I'm not watching that one. Okay, great. That's not going to work at all. Let me just watch it and then make a change to it. I thought this other user was already watching that project file, but they were watching 30-day contract. All right, so let's pop back in here and we'll add a file into that one since he was already watched. So we'll add that file. That's going to represent a change to a watched item. So now if I pop over to this guy, I'm going to see that change in my list. There it is. So an added file, who added it. I can see details about that. Which file, which folder, which project, all that. And I also got a notification in my email. There's my email. So I get an email and it tells me that a change was made to a watched item. And that's just a prompt in case I'm not in PreVeil all the time. I can get an out of band notification. Similar if you have emails that you haven't read in PreVeil, you'll get a notification in your regular mail saying, hey, you have encrypted unread messages. This is the same thing, except you have a watched item change that you need to, go look at if you're interested in seeing what the change was. So I don't get notified of changes I make myself, right? So I had to switch to another user that was watching that folder so that they got the notification. And this other mailbox was for the user that made the change. That's why they did not get the notification. that's how it works. It's pretty straightforward. It's really interesting feature in terms of collaboration. It gives you a lot of power working as a team together and being more efficient when changes happen. And it also gives you some oversight. If you're watching project files as a supervisor and you want to see what's going on, you can track that way. So there's a lot of use cases for this feature. That's pretty much all the material about it.
Thanks, Greg. And just again, to clarify, if folks want to get this capability today, they just have to make sure they're on 5.7.
Yep, 5.7.0, that's available for download on the website right now. It is going to go on the auto updater, but not yet. And that will be done incrementally over time. So everyone will get 5.7 at some point, but if you want it now, you got to go to the website and get it.
Got it. All right. Thanks, Greg. So we're going to just shift gears a little bit now and really focus on CMMC compliance. And again, with that, I'd like to bring in Dr. Timothy Schallbeck, our PreVeil partner, but they're also a CMMC C3PAO. They're an authorized C3PAO, one of the very early ones, as well as a managed security services provider. Tim, anything you add there?
Nope. Yeah, pretty much hit the nail on the head there. Yeah. So we do both C3PAO activities, and we also help organizations with the PreVeil environment, as well as other enclave elements and environments that they can use to be turnkey solutions to be instantly compliant.
Excellent. And, we always like to bring on authorized C3PAOs whenever possible to really try and, cut through the FUD and get direct, clear, concise answers on some of the questions that come up. And I know the topic, for this month is what are the obligations of external service providers? And I guess, it first helps to start with what the definition is. I'm not going to read it for you. The slide is there, but it does include really any external organization that you're using to support your CMMC compliance. That could be cloud service providers, managed security service providers, MSPs, anyone that's going to be either directly helping or process transmit CUI or providing security protection of those assets falls into that definition. There's been a lot of discussion, confusion around, first of all, what's a CSP, what's not a CSP, and then if I'm not a CSP, but I handle security protection data, what are my requirements? Or I am a CSP and I handle security protection data, but not CUI, what are my requirements? I always like to go to authoritative sources, and this is directly from CFR 32. I think this table is probably the best explanation for this. And first of all, we don't have the definition of CSP here. You can find that. They did go and use the NIST definition, not the DoD definition, which was a little bit more broad. But it really is, a CSP has to be able to provide kind of on-demand cloud services. So it's something that the customer has, very little configuration to do, as well as the cloud service provider. Again, the definition, can be found in the NIST glossary. But I think the most important thing from this slide is to understand when do you have to use a FedRAMP authorized or a FedRAMP moderate equivalent service. And we find that exclusively in the top left. If you're using a cloud service provider and they are storing and transmitting CUI, you must use a FedRAMP authorized or FedRAMP moderate equivalent cloud service provider. That's the only time that FedRAMP comes into play when we're talking about external service providers. Everything else is going to then revolve around your customer's assessment, your assessment if you're directly getting assessed, and the obligations, fall from there. Again, I like to reiterate this point because, again, this is the table direct DoD, clearly delineating when you need to consider FedRAMP. If you're a managed service provider and you're supporting a cloud service for your customers, you yourself do not need FedRAMP. Now, if that cloud service that you're managing for them stores, processes, transmits CUI, naturally you'll need to make sure it's FedRAMP authorized or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. But you yourself as an MSP, that obligation does not flow down to you. So I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about this as we get through some of the Q&A that came in. Tim, anything to add there? Because I know this comes up a lot in conversations we have with customers and partners.
No, absolutely. And in some of these cases, it's also sort of what you identify as, because in one capacity, you could be construed a cloud service provider if you're providing platform infrastructure level as a service. But typically, the ESP element has some sort of service element in it, like you're providing some sort of professional guidance, professional services. I know for like our organization specifically, we classify ourselves as an ESP because not only do we provide an environment that we have our own data centers around that's not built in the cloud, but we also provide that professional services edge and layer that actually is providing the actual day-to-day activities and services back to the organization. So as a general rule, if you're a software vendor selling a SaaS solution to organizations and they're going to implement it from there, and you're not really providing any type of professional services or consultation to the customer, you're probably a CSP, right? Otherwise, you're can be classified as an ESP, and there's arguments on both sides as to what you can be and what you aren't. At the end of the day, the OSC or the or organization seeking certification really defines what that boundary is and who those players are based on those contractual agreements. So those are the things that we can be using or should be put into your contracts to be whatever it is that you're identifying as and the capacity that you're serving in sort of some sort of contractual agreement between you and the OSC.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Let's actually kind of tie this one into the overall discussion. It is important to point out we've got a very robust and diverse partner ecosystem. Yeah, as we know, CMMC is complex. There's a lot of different areas. There's a lot of different competencies, that you need to have to help an organization get through their compliance journey. And customers also have varying degrees of expertise, whether it's in cyber, whether it's in compliance. A lot of our small businesses have expertise in neither. And, we find that partners are similar. A lot of partners are great at managed services, managed security services, don't understand compliance. And then we have a lot of partners that are great at compliance, don't understand or don't have the capacity to provide those types of services. So we always encourage you to check out our ecosystem. If you do have any questions, we've got an email alias directly on our website, partnercompliance@preveil.com, that you can reach us at. Yeah, any questions, for Timothy and his team, you've got their contact info there as well. So we always, encourage cross collaboration. We do work with several authorized C3PAOs, including Penacity. If you have customers, that want to get assessed, feel free to reach out to us as well for recommendations there. With that said, we do have a lot of great questions that have come in that we're going to now tackle. The first one, this will be a great one, Tim, for you, given that you are an authorized C3PAO. What are some of the common pitfalls C3PAOs are running into when it comes to their OSCs, using ESPs?
Lack of contractual agreements. That's the big one, right? So when some of the OSCs basically state, hey, that's not my area of responsibility, that's been delegated down to my managed service provider or what is my external service provider, essentially, first thing that we ask for is what's your contract look like and what's the SLA, right? So what is the SLA? What are they responsible for? What are they, working through configuration? We actually just interacted with a construction company most recently who has a fairly large managed service provider conducting those services for them. And that was one of the big areas. They just assumed that the elements of security were just going to be provided without actually being called out within the contract. So if you're developing your documentation, such as your system security plan, your procedures, your policies, make sure that you're identifying within those who's responsible by role, and then make sure those roles are in your contracts. So that way you have a legal mechanism by which to have that organization actually doing the work that they're supposed to be doing, and it's well spelled out, right? And that could be included in all of the people. So like if you've got a system that's an external accounting system that could be dealing with some FCI information, for instance, you're going to have some sort of contractual agreement as to what do they do, what do they take care of, what is the security posture, so on and so forth. Because all those things, when we scope the assessment and what we call, phase one, which is the pre-assessment phase, we're going to be wanting to look at all those contractual agreements with all the things that federal data may touch. And then you provide us the scope of inspection, essentially, and then we agree upon that and move forward with the inspections. But the biggest thing and deficiency areas that we're seeing right now is lack of good contracts being spelled out, what the delineation or responsibility is between you and your external organizations.
Great. And I think that responsibility ties in really well to the next question, which is what is the MSP's obligations as far as a shared responsibility matrix?
So, the external service provider, regardless of who they are, even the CSPs, everyone, that's the next document we want to look at. First one's the contract. The second one is going to be that SRM. So without a shared responsibility model defined, it's very difficult for us to scope or agree to a scope by which our responsibility is dictated by one organization or the other, right? So when you make your procurement choices or you're dusting off those contracts and you're getting ready for your inspections, make sure that anyone who's providing any type of either professional services engagement or sort of managed services to your infrastructure or environment has some sort of shared responsibility model. I'm actually seeing it in software now. So PreVeil has got a shared responsibility model, which is great because it makes it so easy for organizations like us to go in there and say, oh, okay, this is what the customer is responsible for. So these are the questions I need to zero in on during the inspection. And this is what PreVeil is already taking care of. And this is already what falls underneath sort of the FedRAMP equivalency out there. So we don't have to spend as much time, which theoretically should lower costs of your inspections because we're not going to be spending on time on things that we shouldn't be looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. As a cloud service provider, we, especially one that's FedRAMP moderate equivalent, we're required to provide a shared responsibility matrix. If you use an authorized, FedRAMP authorized, they'll have a shared responsibility matrix. And I believe any service provider that's providing services to support your CMMC compliance, needs to have a shared responsibility matrix at this point. One of the popular questions we got was, with the recent changes to the administration, do you see anything modifying CMMC compliance? I think we kind of touched upon this. There might be, a slight initial delay to the CFR 48 as far as when CMMC will start appearing in contracts. But I think that, what we've seen with Katie Arrington coming back as the DoD CISO, who was, the person that was spearheading CMMC 1.0, I think that really codifies, the fact that CMMC is here to stay. And if anything, I think, given that this was her number one priority back when she served under the previous administration, I think she's going to spearhead this and put a lot of energy behind it. This was a good question that came. Where in MSSP we have root level access to customer devices. What level of CMMC certification do we need as an ESP? And how do we do this cost effectively while still providing, exceptional service with minimal delay to responding to any sort of security incidents?
So this is a very popular question as to, do I need to have a CMMC certification as an ESP? So let me quantify that for you a little bit, right? Let's scope it out. If you're basically providing a service to the customer on their own premise and all the data and information is in their systems and you have no CUI or FCI information that will be transported, worked on, or stored within your ESP systems, and it's all completely in that OSC set of systems, and you're just basically like an employee or 1099 of that organization and doing those things, the short answer is that the burden's on the OSC to define all that in their own contracts, as well as their policies, procedures, and their some security plan, because that defines your role. You're just an extension of their organization at that point. Now things get a little bit different. So if you are hosting servers on the behalf of the customer, there's two types of MSPs or ESPs that I've seen here. One is they host it on their own premise and they use their own infrastructure. In that case there, if you are storing, transporting, or processing CUI, you definitely need to get a CMMC certification because that's a requirement of the Part 170 in the third CFR rule, right? So there's that. But if you're using cloud service providers, the CSPs themselves, so you're an ESP using a CSP, but providing the service back down to the OSC, the cloud service provider definitely needs to be FedRAMP. You can inherit that through their shared responsibility model, but then you need to create a shared responsibility model as to what you cover back down to the OSC overall. But if you still transport, work on, or have any CUI, basically you own that cloud services. And that's the big thing. So like of Azure, for instance, whether it's GCC, GCCI, commercial is not really an acceptable solution. There's a whole wonderful Microsoft blog that the CISO has really written on why you need to go to something like GCC or GCCI. AWS is the Fed Cloud tier, and then GCP's got their own federal element out there as well. You still have to develop that shared responsibility model because you effectively are the owner of those resources once deployed, and you're maintaining and managing those resources in that shared responsibility model aspect. So basically, processing or storing or have CUI, go get a CMMC certification. It'll make things less complicated. Otherwise, the OSC is really paying for you. And if you have multiple customers that are OSCs out there, you're going to have to sit inspection after inspection after inspection, burning a lot of time, effort, and resources. And they're going to get the CMMC certification. You're not. That doesn't flow down to you. You have to go get your own, or you have to participate in the CMMC certification process to the satisfaction of the organization to be able to get that CMMC certification overall for that OSC organization. Hopefully I explained that well, but this is where it could get very muddy and confusing. But if you have a lot of customers and you're processing CUI or have CUI in your possession, just get a CMMC certification. That's the simplest answer I would give you. And that way you could, like the PreVeil product, not have to sit an inspection every single time they come through. They could very easily just take a look at your body of evidence, see your shared responsibility model, and then move on, right? It'll the costs for your customers, and it will lower the complexity for you. But again, if you're operating only in that 1099 aspect of just providing a service, then you're nothing more than an employee of the OSC, and then the burden is mostly in their court.
Thanks. Yeah, I think to sum it up, ultimately, it is a business decision. There'll be some MSPs, MSSPs that have one or two DIB customers. They're comfortable sitting through that assessment. They, don't directly touch the CUI. But if you are an MSSP and you've got, 10 plus customers, it's probably going to be a lot more cost effective for you to just go ahead and get your certification rather than relying and being part of a lot of assessments. I think that's good. And just a real quick point of clarification, when it comes to, the Microsoft ecosystem, commercial is not suitable for storing, processing, transmitting CUI. We do have a lot of customers that still use commercial and augment it with PreVeil because they use PreVeil to do the storage, processing, transmitting, and then the security protection. They don't have to be FedRAMP because they're not actually touching any CUI. Just make sure they're configured properly. And that's how, we've got a lot of customers and partners that do go that path for a little bit of cost savings.
Yeah, the good rule is this, reduce your scope as much as possible. And anything that does not process CUI, in specifically specified CUI, those are the categories in NARA, the National Archives, right? Like CTI is the most popular out there. So if you only assets that are processing the CUI need to be within scope of your CMMC inspection, anything else that is just FCI, just federal contract information, which is anything other than that special category, does not require a CMMC level 2 certification. So just hopefully that helps out with scoping. If you voluntarily make your scope bigger than it should be, no one's ever gone to jail for being overzealous. But I would ask people to reduce your burdens as much as possible and only include the scopes of your bound be those things that are specific to CUI.
Right. So we got a few questions that have come in now that I think will be good to answer. We do use a lot of acronyms on here. Apologize if we get a little overzealous with the alphabet soup. So a quick question came in. What's SPD? SPD stands for Security Protection Data. That is, think of things like logs into a SIM, vulnerability management data, configuration, anything that can give you some insight into the configuration of the systems, provide information around the vulnerabilities potentially within the system. That's called security protection data. It is a CMMC term, and it does require some protection, but not to the same level as CUI. Next question that I see is, Lisa, do you have a VDI environment where end user can process and store CUI? This, we can keep it away from end user assets. And can you share a roadmap, VDI support Office 365? So yeah, great question. And I think just again, for clarity's sake, VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure, really important term to understand because the DoD explicitly made a carve out for organizations that choose to use a VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure, within their CMMC compliance boundary. What's nice about that is, and for those that don't understand or don't completely know what a VDI is, that's essentially when you have, a computer environment hosted somewhere else being secured. Typically, it'll be secured by the hosting provider, maybe in combination with an MSP, MSSP. Tim can certainly tell you a little bit more about Panacity's VDI environment in just a second. But the end result is that if you have a properly configured VDI that you're logging in from your endpoint, your endpoint has no ability to copy, to download, to print screen, no ability to manipulate the information beyond what you can do through the keyboard, then that particular endpoint is considered out of scope. So there are no CMMC controls you have to apply directly to that endpoint, so long as you're accessing a properly configured VDI. So Tim, please do tell us a little bit about Panacity's VDI environment.
Absolutely. So first I want to preface this that the Enclave or desktop solution is a great way to go to reduce where COI is being processed at. There's a lot of organizations that process COI like potentially out of their homes, right? So if it's on your laptop and it's in your home, you're processing COI in your home, which actually means that if you're one of those small business owners who operate out of their home as your primary business operational area, that actually opens your home up to inspection during the inspection process because COI is being stored and processed within your house. So it's a great way to be able to say, okay, instead of me having it on my laptop in my house, I could have it in the cloud, in a virtual desktop, essentially, that is not in my personal area. And that is a great way to segregate those, the COI from there. It also reduces your scope of burden because now your home is no longer open to the inspection because you're no longer processing and storing COI up there. And really our solution is just that. It's a very basic virtual desktop solution that can run any of your software for your organization. It can even to your printers. We have manufacturing facilities actually running their entire manufacturing assembly lines out of our environment that have been secured end to end. And the best part is that it's completely turnkey so that we pretty much, you deal with 99% of all the things from us, and you only a very handful of other things, like maybe 10 or 15 small controls. Do you have to document on your side? And we just kind of help you through that in combination by using the PreVeil ecosystem and PreVeil as well to help you establish a good, boundary of documentation for that assessment coming up in your future.
Thanks, Tim. Here's another question that came in that really goes deep into the alphabet soup here, but it says, if an ESP provides CUI data storage for the OSC inside the ESP's NOC, Network Operations Center, is the ESP a CSP? Not going to try and read that 3 times fast, but essentially, the way I'm reading this is the ESP could be an MSP, could be, I guess, a cloud service provider.
This always goes back to my default of selecting your pronouns. This is what you identify as, right?
Yeah.
Essentially. So if you identify as an ESP, because an ESP is classified as both a cloud service provider or a provider in general, right?
Yeah.
And that actually might encompass a cloud solution in there. Typically, your CSPs are specifically going to be just software that you buy, install, and is managed for you in a platform manner, right? So PreVeil is a great example of that. But there's also like EDR platforms like ThreatLocker, for instance, or Microsoft's own proprietary antivirus software. Those are all platform level solutions. So those are really purely a CSP play. So the scenario you gave, I would identify as an ESP, get a CMMC certification. So that way it's a much easier and less of a burden to get. PreVeil can tell you that the FedRAMP is no joke. It's 853 versus 171, which is roughly almost three times the level of controls and effort to secure. And it's very difficult to get through that process versus a CMMC inspection. It's only a few days. It's fairly simple, straightforward, and easy to secure. And unlike FedRAMP, where you have to report every single month all your stuff, you only have to report or get a reinspection every 3 years, and you have no ongoing reporting burdens other than maintaining a body of evidence for your customers moving forward. So that's the better play in my book. It's way cheaper on price, and it's much better. So if you can identify as an ESP and make that argument, identify as an ESP.
As an ESP that is not a CSP,
you might use a CSP element in your stuff, and sure, that stuff should be FedRAMP, i.e. like using Azure, Microsoft stuff or whatnot, or even PreVeil, right? So, like we're a great example of that. We're an ESP that uses a CSP within the execution of our duties and our NOC, if you will, because we have a SOC/NOC that does all the overwatch of all these things as also. There's also some shared responsibility between other third-party organizations and tool vendors that we use as well, but that's where our contracts are all very tightly coupled. But we still only identify as an ESP. We still have our CMMC level 2 certification, and ergo, that's our burden. That's why we don't need to move to a FedRAMP moderate, because we're not providing a SaaS or platform solution that's purely that. It's more of an environmental play and also ongoing helping hands, assistance, expertise, consultancy.
Excellent. So next question, how is SPD against security protection data treated any different from CUI? Does it require FedRAMP equivalent protection? If we recall the table that is directly from CFR 32, the DoD has defined when you have SPD that does not include CUI, that it does not require FedRAMP. FedRAMP is only required when you're storing and transmitting CUI in a cloud service provider. If you're just using security protection data, let's say you're running a SIM solution, or you've got a vulnerability management system, so long as those systems do not store, process, transmit CUI, FedRAMP is not a part of the requirement. You do have to meet the applicable 800-171 controls for the security protection data, and particularly how that security protection asset is providing those services. So it is still included in the assessment, but you're not required FedRAMP for that.
Yeah, and I think you hit on the most important part there, Jamie, is that you have to have the security of 800-171. Matter of fact, we just got done working with a software provider that delivers the software. Their software sits on the machine and provides the security of the CUI in the machine, but they then have a control panel in the cloud for which the SPA, so security protection assets, right, that process that security protection data and present that data to the customer, right? It's got workflows, email notifications, all sorts of things out there. So we did a NIST 800-171 attestation for their software company to basically say, hey, we're the third party coming in, taking a look at their items, but in the area of 800-171, where it states that certain controls apply only to CUI, those could be not applicable. So we can't really, like the encryption element, so a nuance here is that you wouldn't require to have the FIPS 140-2 certified encryption. In this case, you could use a non-FIPS certified encryption or FIPS compliant encryption element to it. That is the very, different nuance there, but you're absolutely right. The Part 170 very specifically states that if you're not processing, transporting, or storing CUI, you have no burden of having that certification, but you still have to rise to the level of protection because you are potentially an attack vector for a third-party actor to come in and compromise those systems. So you're only strong as your weakest point.
Exactly. Another question here, if an ESP that transmits CUI is in a VDI, are you still assessing that ESP against all 110 controls and assessment objectives?
This one's a fairly easy one to answer.
Okay.
So this goes back to our original two things that we talked about when we first started. What contract with the organization, with the OSC, what is the shared responsibility model look like? And that's what's in scope of inspection. Also, do you already have a certification? Do you have a FedRAMP or do you have a CMMC certification? If those answers are all yes, then all we're going to do is maybe take a look at the body of evidence, maybe some logs and other things, just to make sure things look like they're on the up and up. Keep in mind that the assessor can make the call as to whatever they feel the most comfortable with. So they may not look at it at all and trust it if they're familiar with this, or they might ask for some additionally amplifying information around those systems out there, but expect to be at least a part of the scope or be providing some sort of body of evidence information, mostly around what's in your shared responsibility model. So if you're doing a vulnerability assessment once a year, once a quarter, make sure you have the last maybe few vulnerability assessment elements on hand for being able to disseminate in a package to the organization. Whenever we work with ESPs or CSPs, in this case here, we would contact them, or they would be in the initial through the OSC, and we'd say, here's the things that we would like to see through those. And then usually they'd reach out to organizations like PreVeil, and PreVeil would provide their body of evidence, which they already have available for us to go take a look at, right? So that hopefully will answer that question.
Thanks, Tim. Got another one here, which I think is good. So what if an ESP hosts backups in its own data center? Would the ESP be considered a CSP?
No, there's still an ESP. Now, This could be another one of those things. So if you're using a Datto backup solution, for instance, Datto is actually FedRAMPed. So you are an ESP using a CSP essentially in the execution of your duties there. So, but if you have CUI in those backups and you are storing them in your facility, you now need a CMMC certification or FedRAMP moderate. Your choice, choose your own adventure at this point.
Okay. Yeah, I would think that goes back to, kind of the characteristics of a cloud service provider, which is, on-demand self-service, rapid elasticity. You're not necessarily getting those if you're simply managing backups, right? That's typically a more manual process. So I can see.
It's more of a, again, to think of it as a bespoke service. If you're providing a service as part of your providing of things, right? Not just Datto is a great example of this. Datto is a backup solution that you download, install, and it just does things. You don't interact with that company in any other way other than with their software. So they are definitely a CSP. But if you are a managed service or external service provider, and you are providing the service of installing those backups, ensuring that they're there, doing disaster recovery as a service or whatnot for that organization, in my mind, you could definitely make the argument of being an ESP because you're providing the services.
Great. Did have a question specifically for Panacity. Is there a minimum number of VDIs one can sign up for? There was a question about costs. We don't address costs on these simply because this is recorded and, that can be information that we don't necessarily want to get out.
Absolutely.
But we will talk about minimum. And then how would it work with PreVeil? We can assure you it works great with PreVeil. We have multiple customers that are using the Panacity VDI, so no issue there.
Yep, absolutely. And just for minimums on our side, 3 users or more are always welcome. That's it. That's the minimum buy-in to get there. We find that fits 99.9% of all the organizations out there. We specifically cater to organizations between 50 and 300, roughly. So we have some companies with just 5 people in or 15 people in the system out there. So PreVeil is the only solution that we're recommending within our enclave for delivery of files and email. We went to go design our own solution around that. It just was a lot more complex. And so we decided to go and partner with PreVeil specifically because of the FedRAMP elements. And PreVeil, fun fact, was the first organization in history to be CMMC compliant by having that FedRAMP moderate equivalency. And they're in a very small club that I can count on one hand of people who have passed through that, because that is a very difficult process. So they have definitely raised the bar on their security side.
Thanks, Tim. And kudos to Greg and his team who've worked tirelessly for literally years to get to that point. So I think Greg had, a few more hairs and they weren't quite as gray when he started with PreVeil. But I think this is a great point to wrap up at. We had a lot more questions. We'll go through them. If there are any, we will try to email out some additional answers if there's some we missed. We had a lot of great questions come in, so really appreciate all of the support and the feedback from the community. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and special thanks to Tim and Panacity. We really enjoy working with them. With that said, we'll hopefully see you guys in a couple of months. I'll be able to dress up a little bit more. I won't be in this, and if I am, I'll probably take the call from somewhere in Florida. So thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.